Yeah. Okay. And then I'm going to, so yeah, I think I'm going to start now. Is that okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to be recording this and live streaming at the same time. Awesome. Okay. So you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. And welcome everybody to this roundtable. I want to appreciate all of you for making the time to join us here this morning, maybe afternoon or evening where you are. Thank you so much for giving us part of your day to have a discussion on a very pressing issue that is there to most of us. I will be moderating this roundtable with my colleague, Professor Nduka Otiono, who is the director of the Institute of African Studies at Carleton. He's on his way, he's a bit late, but I'm mentioning this because the idea of getting this roundtable is almost entirely his initiative. It started a couple of weeks back when Dr. Yusuf Hassan reached out to me to see what I can do here at York University. I am the coordinator of the African Studies program to raise attention here at the university, but also in Canada about the crisis in Sudan. And I told him that I am going to reach out to Dr. Otiono because I am the co-chair of the local organizing committee for this year's the CAS conference here at York. And he was very interested in what he can do to be able to support Dr. Hassan to raise awareness about the crisis in Sudan. We've been able to put together a solidarity statement that is included in the CAS program for this year's conference. We are giving Dr. Hassan about 15 minutes to make a statement during the conference. And then Dr. Otiono thought that we could put together very quickly a roundtable. So it is all to his credit that we are able to organize this in a very short time. And I want to thank our distinguished roundtable speakers. We got to them at a very short notice, and they were all very willing to make the time to contribute to this conversation. It is an important topic, but also a very sad topic. I wish we were coming together to talk about what was not too long ago on the horizon for the people of Sudan in terms of their revolution, in terms of their fight for freedom, democracy, and peace. But it is a very sad turnaround. So it is a topic that is somber to almost all of us. But I think it's good for us to come together to hear from our speakers and to get into this conversation about this crisis in Sudan and see how we could be able to increase more attention to it to be able to get the appropriate response and hopefully to get quick and lasting political resolution to the crisis. So in terms of our format for today, I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and then each of them would provide an initial submission of about 7 minutes in the first round. We will have another round for them to make another 7 minutes submission. And then I would interject, and I'm sure Dr. Otiono would be here with some questions for them. After their responses, we would open it up to all of you to make your comment and to pose questions that you may have for the speakers. Okay, so let me briefly introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will speak. So I'm going to begin with Dr. Yusuf Hassan, who is going to speak first. Dr. Hassan is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and he is recently appointed. So congratulations, Dr. Hassan. He's also an associate fellow with the Harriet Tubman Institute for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora at York University. He is also a distinguished fellow at the School of Information Sciences and a faculty affiliate with the Center of African Studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. The next speaker will be Dr. Khalid Midani, which I have the privilege to introduce because he was my professor when I was studying at McGill, and he was my supervisor. So I am very pleased to introduce him here this morning. Dr. Madani is an associate professor in political science and Islamic studies, and he is also the chair of the African Studies program at McGill University. His research focuses on globalization and the political economy of Islamist and ethnic politics in Africa and the Middle East. He is the author of a recently published book titled Black Markets and Militants, the Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa. And that book was the winner of the American Political Science Association Best Book in the field of Middle East and North African politics by a senior scholar. The next speaker I'm going to introduce is Dr. Nesreen Elamin, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and African Studies at the University of Toronto. Her work investigates the connection between land, race, belonging, and empire making in Sudan and the broader Sahel region. She uses land and the struggles over land and as a lens through which to examine state surveillance and Sahelian migration, as well as Gulf Arab corporate investment and political interventions in Sudan and neighboring countries. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Kon Madut, who is a part-time professor at the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Ottawa. He is a member of the Canadian Sociological Association and the American Sociology Association, and is an associate member of the Taos Institute. He has published in several peer-reviewed journals, and his work focuses on the discourse of ethnic politics and identity issues in Canada and South Sudan. As you can tell from the bio, we have a very good lineup of distinguished speakers that I'm sure are going to do justice to this topic today. I'm going to open it now for our speakers to make their initial submission, and I will call on Dr. Yusuf Hassan to start us off. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Mohammed. And I would like to begin, by thanking the African Studies at Carleton University and the African Studies at York University and McGill University as well for convening this roundtable on the very urgent situation in Sudan. And of course, I would like to thank Professor like Otieno on basically organizing this, like this round table and suggesting it in the first place. And I also would like to thank my co-panelists and the audience for joining us today in this discussion. Perhaps I would like to begin from the title of the roundtable itself, the crisis in Sudan. And I would like to interrogate the idea of crisis itself as a category and as a concept and as an idea that has been pretty much at play and at the center of a lot of scholarship and political discussions and debates around Africa and around Sudan as well. And this is for many reasons, because Sudan is said to be in crisis for a very long time. Perhaps we can go back to the beginning period, like post-independence, and like my colleague Professor Madani, he will talk probably about that in terms of the effects of colonialism, but also the recent war perhaps is the most devastating and severe form of the manifestation of that crisis. And also, as an African scholars, and as Sudanese scholars as well, we can also relate to the dominant narratives about Africa as a continent that is actually in a persistent state of crisis. So in rethinking crisis as a category, crisis is often invoked to donate actually certain claims about truth, and state of affairs and diagnosis of the present, of the current moment that we live in. And when we talk about crisis, we imply certain comparative judgment towards a specific norm. But the question becomes crisis compared to what? What is state of norm, right? And I think that African studies has a lot of literature that shows how crisis is actually mobilized to show how conflict and disorder generate new norms. So it becomes really the new norms, after crisis. And specifically in the case of Sudan, for example, the narrative of crisis legitimized the rapid support forces, one of the parties, like in the current conflict, as a state paramilitary group and part of the state apparatus for border control. And this is, part of a historical context into the conflict, because I specifically here talk about the African migration crisis and the role that it actually played in the emergence of the rapid support forces as a legitimate actor in the political scene in Sudan through a process called Khartoum process, which was a key process established to deal with the issue of, the crisis of African migration to Europe. And this was supported by the European Union and many of the other Western and regional actors as well. Another manifestation of crisis that really helped in legitimizes some of the actors in the current situation in Sudan is the war in Yemen, right? And, as another way or another a crisis that basically legitimized the rapid support forces, especially when we think about the global and regional, attention to the threats in the region in terms of, the global war on terrorism, then the threats of nuclear war, the threats of Iran in the region, and so forth. So in the present moment, in the current, crisis or the so-called crisis in Sudan, I think we need to begin with this interrogation of crisis in the current context for a few reasons, right? So the first one is we see that the narratives of crisis produced in the media and by many of the international political actors overlooked key elements of the conflict as it pertains to the political economy of the conflict itself and the politics of knowledge about the conflict itself. It simply ignores or prevents us from any deeper reflection or analysis of the root causes of the conflict itself. And the same narratives of crisis actually produces a particular kind of deficit logic that's actually been at play in the African situation and in Sudan for a long time. And this deficit logic basically operates in a way that foregrounds regional instability, security issues, global terrorism as the main causes for the lack of democracy and development in the region. And this is basically legitimizes the intervention of regional and international political actors into the political scene in different countries in Africa, including Sudan. And at the same time, what it really does, it actually excludes important local actors, such as pro-democracy movements, civil society, from the new state of affairs because of their perceived inability to control the state apparatus, including obviously the army, especially in this case, and the economy and so forth. And I think probably my colleague Nasreen as well will talk later about the movement on the ground and the role that pro-democracy movements are actually doing on the ground there. So I think it's very important for us to think when we're basically talking about the current, events in Sudan, is to think about what kind of knowledge this framing of crisis is actually producing in the current situation. What work does the category of crisis is actually doing in the current political negotiation in terms of how we navigate the situation, and also even our aspirations for what kind of futures we're actually looking for in Sudan and in the region. And I think this is probably it's an issue that's not really particular to Sudan. I think it's in a lot of other geographies in Africa as well. So I guess from this point, I just want to make just very quick observations, and I will pass it on to my other colleagues. But I think the first observation that I would like to make is basically at the core of this issue and the conflict that's currently taking place in Sudan is the issue of democratization and the vision for economic and social development in Sudan. And I think that's really at the core and heart, of the matter itself. And I want to invite us to really, think about that and not really foreground those kinds of issues for, the dominant narratives around, around crisis and just the present, right? Because when we're talking about democratizations and visions for economic development and social development, we're also talking about the future, which I think is very important part of our discussion today. The other thing as well, let's not forget also that a key element of the current conflict is basically the two parties who are in the conflict now, the army and the rapid support forces. Both of them are actually seeking political legitimacy, right? And this is something that they've been trying to do since the uprising in 2018. In so many different ways through, the involvement in the transitional period, then, the coup in October 2021, and recently with the war. So it's really a struggle for political legitimacy because we know that on the ground, they don't have any, civil society or political movement behind them. They really lack political legitimacy on the ground. Right. And this is something that, was very clear from the beginning. And I think, in that regard as well, the two parties, although they try to, turn this into a civil war, but I think one of the unique characteristics of the current crisis in Sudan, although it's an armed conflict, but it's not a civil war. And I think that's a very important distinction when we analyze the situation. Because it really poses a lot of challenges for the two parties in the conflict itself, as well as for the international community when we're talking about intervention later, right? Because it doesn't really fit the narratives of the normal civil wars that we see in Africa. And I think that's as a result of the fact that the Sudanese people, they really know what's at stake in this war. for them. Right. So I think that's, that's very important. That's very important consideration. And I think I will stop here. I will give the floor to my other colleagues, and we can go back and revisit some of these topics later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. This is certainly a very good opener for us. I mean, we have to be critical of the way we deploy the narrative of the language of crisis, and I think we're going to build on this in the subsequent submission. I will pass it now to Dr. Midani, who is going to talk to us about the colonial structural undertone and underpinning of the conflict and the crisis in Sudan. Professor Midani.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, great. I would like to, first of all, just like my colleague and friend, Professor Hassan, I wanted to thank Professor Sese and Dr. Antonio, of course, and I'm particularly honored and privileged to be part of it and representing McGill's African Studies program and to work with York and Carlton. So this is really a great honor for myself and the program at McGill that I represent, the faculty, the students, the staff, and we really hope that we can continue to partner. And I'm especially honored and grateful, like my colleagues are, that we're taking this time and you've invited us to talk about Sudan, especially at this point. And so I want to thank you all for that, and my colleagues also for coming. I wanted to talk about something. I'm a political scientist, and I was challenged by, and this is why it's so great to be part of these kind of discussions, by Dr. Antonio's note in terms of introducing this panel. You always learn from your colleagues and, of course, students, Mohammed. I can certainly tell you that. In that, there's, of course, a discussion in the introduction of the panel with respect to the central part of the problem in Sudan at the moment, and that is, of course, the fight between two generals, the factionalization of the militia. But he goes further to challenge us to think about, without absolving these two generals or displacing the responsibility of this war, this horrible war, squarely on their shoulders, but also to understand the challenges of colonialism in Africa and in Sudan in particular, and decolonization. And that inspired me to write down just a few notes about the colonial experience, specifically as it relates to the issue of the military in Sudan. Just some points that I think maybe we could open up the discussion. The narrative and that we've discussed since the beginning of the conflict in April 15th is, I think, by now well rehearsed and acknowledged. And some of us have written about it. And that is, of course, we usually begin with 1989, the previous regime, and the policies in Sudan of what we call Temkin, empowerment, that had certain pillars for those not familiar with Sudan. One of them, of course, was state predation, the use of the state to amass wealth, the deep state that they built beginning in 1989 all the way to the revolution of 2018 and 19. The other aspect, of course, is the domination of the economy, the financial markets, which has been so important for Bashir's regime and the National Congress Party that he led for 30 years. And the other issue, of course, is the policy of factionalization, the coup-proofing we talk about. That is factionalizing the militia in order to undermine the standing national army. That, of course, is part of the historical context and chronology. The catalyst, and very quickly, and I'm saying this only for people who have not followed as closely as the rest of us, and that is, of course, the catalyst following the what we call the Thawra al-Majida, the Great Revolution of 2018-2019, of course, was the coup of October 2021 that Burhan and Hemeti, the two protagonists fighting now in Sudan, engaged in order to safeguard both their economic wealth and political power. And from there, of course, we have the framework agreement that comes in on the heels in December 2022, I believe, that it was ratified but not signed in terms of the first phase. And this, once again, is for those listening, and that is this issue of contentious issues that were deferred. Tragically, one of them, of course, is not only the issues of dismantling the economy of the former regime and the deep state, but centrally, of course, the issue of integrating the militia security sector reform that become the catalyst for this horrible conflict that sparked in 2019. And that all leads me to a very important central slogan of the Sudanese revolution, the young people and everyone millions, and that is Sha'bun Wahid, Jayshun Wahid. For those not Arabic speakers, this persistent call, I think that we need to emphasize. I always go by these contentious, or rather repertoires of contention and slogans, because they're Thank you for that. I think that's a encouragement. Shukran. That central issue is what I want to talk about very quickly. I tend to and that is that this call for one united army. There is across the social spectrum and political spectrum in Sudan, and even outside for those who are sound analysts, no substitution save in the future, long term, of a national standing army that has a legitimate role, as Professor Hassan said, but also has its should be right and traditional kind of obligation to secure the defense of the country and not kill people, as what is happening now. So very quickly, I kind of asked myself, encouraged by this panel, what are the main elements associated with why the national army in Sudan is so weak, and what is the origin of these paramilitary militias in Sudan? The very central central problem that is articulated by the revolutionaries, the resistance committees, and everyone from the very beginning of the revolution, not calling for the dismantling of the national standing army, but actually the calling and demanding that the national army actually stands on the side of the people and the people's will. And here I want to refer, and this is going to be, and this is a sheer coincidence in doing very quick research, we go back to the origins of the colonial era. Like all African armies, and I think Professor Sese and all of you, I think, are familiar that the very origin of the armies that we know now in Africa stem from the colonial period. And in the case of Sudan, it stems from the relationship between the British and Egypt as well. Almost 100 years to the month, in 1919, the 1919 revolution in Egypt that called for the expulsion of the British occupation of Egypt had ripple effects that I'm going to argue here very quickly, really set the stage for British colonial policy vis-a-vis the military in Sudan in ways that have a legacy for our understanding, not only the weakened kind of state of the National Standing Army, but also the kind of factionalization of the military. And I would argue further, because we'll discuss it later, another form of dependence where the military institutions in Sudan are chronically dependent from the outside. And this is where we see, of course, the intervention of other external actors so determinant in terms of these two general protagonists that are determining the future and the politics of Sudan. So very quickly, following the 1919 revolution, British policy in Sudan vis-a-vis the military changed. The authority that was given to the Egyptian Khedive at the time was taken back by the British, and the Sudanese standing army was at that time created in the guise of what the British called the Sudan Defense Force. The Sudan Defense Force is essentially the precursor to the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces. And I want to just highlight just a couple of things. I hope that they will be of interest. Number one was the issue of ensuring that this force would be have allegiance to the British, not to protect the borders of Sudan, so to speak, although that was part of it, but for two reasons. One of them is to suppress dissent and uprisings, which they did very effectively, and I'll explain how the British went about doing that in the same kind of processes that we see happening at the moment. One of the aspects that was so important, and this is similar in other African countries, in the case of Sudan, all military forces now came after this revolution because of the Egyptian opposition under the complete control of British authorities. And here the country was divided in 5 military areas. I'm not going to detail them all, only to say that the Sudan Defense Forces was not nationalized to protect the territorial integrity of even colonial Sudan, but rather they were actually divided along different regions, northern area, Kordofan and Darfur and other areas, which was really important. The primary reason that this was done, number one, was for internal security. the internal security and to kind of find a structure of the Sudanese armed forces that would perpetuate, of course, imperial rule on the part of the British. And at the same time, divide them along ethnic grounds in ways that would divide the population through divide and rule. But very, very importantly, and I think here is something that is important for Sudanese and our discussion of the colonial legacy, and that is the literal creation of paramilitary militias. It was not, I discovered belatedly, necessarily Bashir or Kaysan, although they of course advanced this, but rather the British that really after 1925, following the assassination of Sir Lee Stack in Cairo by Egyptian nationalists, that you had the factionalization and the need on the part of the British to factionalize the militia. And they did this for a couple of reasons. I won't belabor it too much, but I think that you'll see in this narrative very much the legacy of a weak standing army and the expansion of factionalization and paramilitary militias, similar in other countries as well. The way they did this is primarily in order to reduce the form or the force, the Sudan Defense Force, to a level of a paramilitary police. And that was to make sure that it would be immune from national agitation. In fact, those officers that kind of aligned themselves with nationalist causes were not only tried, but executed in the context of the colonial rule in the late 1920s, which was really important. Another issue was to reduce the military expenses on the colonial side. And that was really important. And here you begin to see the emphasis on the part of the British, not on regular forces, but irregular forces. The number one reason, I'll explain in a minute, but another reason was the colonial kind of exigencies of trying to reduce expenditures, and it was cheaper to actually have lesser paid, lesser trained irregular forces. But the most important aspect, and the legacy here is really important and central, is that these irregular troops were actually much more adept at putting down uprisings, whether it's in northern Sudan or western Sudan or elsewhere, or even southern Sudan against the Nuer, for example, in the late 1920s. And here, irregular troops were used as mobile units, maybe composed of about 150 to 200. And here we see the remnants and the style and strategy and structure of the rapid support forces. In fact, the British conceived them as support forces to the British officers themselves that manned the colonial army in Sudan. Here you have a policy of not only undermining the national standing army, but also by the late 1920s and certainly by the 1930s, the use of mobile so-called rapid force units in order to undermine and put down dissent, which was really important. These were tactical mobile units that were used in the same way, unfortunately, that we see Hemeti. They were also deployed to engage in street battles in the same way as against, for example, protesters, nationalist protesters in Sudan in the Gordon Memorial College, in addition to other regions in the country, which is really important. That becomes an important legacy. I want to conclude with two, if you don't mind, because of these notes. I hope that's an interest and it's reminiscent, or at least the legacies of this colonial period is important. One of them is how these soldiers were recruited and how that was so important in terms of the colonial period. Now, these were units that were irregular but recruited along ethnic lines, and that becomes a really important aspect. But in addition to ethnicity, usually routinely they were actually recruited from less developed areas. In other words, the financial incentives of the poorer regions of Sudan, where people were looking, or young men looking for opportunities, is very reminiscent of the kind of recruitment drives that Hemeti and his brother employ, which is really important to keep in mind. In addition to that, they utilized the closed district ordinance, for those of you familiar with Sudan's history, that divided the South and the North in terms of legally, in terms of trade and cultural exchange. They utilized that in the army. The army itself was divided along ethnic lines. As one British officer put it, that was to avoid the possible repercussions of periodical contact between the pagan Nuba and the Mohammedan world of the North. This closed district ordinance that has a legacy of eventually leading or contributing to the partition partition of Sudan in 2011, also was employed in terms of the military apparatus as well. And finally, there is, of course, the role of personnel and the culture of the military in Sudan. One of the biggest problems we have right now, and of course, Sudanese are engaged in it, is particularly those involved in the protest, is this violent battle between their own will and wish for a democracy, and also a wish for Jayshun Wahid, a one army that's professional. Why is it that we have such a politicized army in Sudan, a country that has witnessed 16 attempted military coups, more than any other countries? Without understanding some of the legacies of the colonial period, I think it will be very difficult to do that. This kind of final point has to do with who was actually, employed, or rather recruited at the officer level in Sudan. In the late early 1930s, the British actually closed the #1 military school and academy because it was agitating for independence. That was reopened because of the threat of Ethiopia in East Africa, and they needed to recruit Sudanese officers, of course, below the British officer ranks, which is really important to keep in mind. These were recruited in ways that excluded those nationalist, or what they perceived as radical nationalist agitators. And here, the emphasis on the part of the British was to recruit those who were most loyal, as they put the loyal families into the military apparatus. These came from particular tribal chiefs and local administrators. It is no surprise then that you see Burhan, even more than Hemeti, although Hemeti has deployed, this notion of native authorities as being the singular most important support and constituency as a way to divide and rule, in the same kind of perspective or policies that the British employed in their policy vis-a-vis the military. I want to conclude with a quote by a wonderful Sudanese scholar from whom I learned so much, that I think encapsulates this entire discussion in a way that I would like to leave you with. It's from Ahmed Al-Awad Muhammad, who since the 1970s had been writing and studying the history of colonialism in Sudan as it pertains to the military, and highlighting the challenges, the continued challenges of what I just began with, and that is the Sudanese striving not only for democracy, but also really believing very strongly that without one nation with one standing army, in a way that even political scientists cannot actually eloquently articulate as a form central to state formation, state building, and democratization. As Professor Muhammad put it, since these officers had served under the British officers, and he's talking about the Sudanese military elite here, they had inherited a colonial tradition and outlook, and let their colonial predecessors revert to indirect rule, thus following the most conservative forces of society, tribal chiefs and local administrators. And he is reminding us that these legacies of colonialism, including, and here the agency part is important, a military ideology that's less professional and much more instrumentalist and self-serving, is one of the central legacies that are underpinning and underlying this particular conflict in my country. So I want to stop there. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Professor Medani, for such a helpful and a very effective overview of the colonial origin of the Sudanese army and related security institutions in Sudan. And it resonates very well to many African countries. It's a very good segue to Professor Elamin, who is going to talk about the present humanitarian crisis and its impact on the civilian population. Professor Elamin.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for organizing this. I feel really greatly honored to be here. I'm not quite sure I deserve to be on this panel, but I will try to make a contribution here. I've learned from everyone who's already spoken so much. So I want to actually maybe pick up where Dr. Madani kind of ended, because I think part of what we're looking at here is that these two generals are vying not only for political control of the country, but also economic control. So I want to talk a little bit about political economy before then shifting to the humanitarian situation and the response really that is mostly being carried by these pro-democracy forces that Dr. Hassan talked about, neighborhood resistance committees that have filled this vacuum of a kind of international aid community that is for the most part evacuated and ceased operations, especially in the areas hardest hit. And I think part of the argument I want to make in terms of this humanitarian response is that it very much represents the continuation of the popular revolution against this military regime that has sort of imploded and is fighting itself, if you will. So let me start with a historical note here. Britain's colonial parting gift to Sudan was an economy dependent on the extraction of raw materials like cotton and a political system which was constructed to serve the interests of a central Sudanese ruling elite at the expense of other regions and of a rural population that sustained this extractive, export-oriented economy. Some of the initial forms of resistance against the new post-colonial state in the 1950s unsurprisingly came from tenant farmers who organized to demand, among other things, a greater share of profits as cotton prices plummeted. So, for example, a strike took place on a cotton scheme near Kosti shortly after Sudan's independence in 1956, and the state responded with extreme violence. Over 300 striking tenant farmers were shot or suffocated in poorly ventilated detention cells. My father, who was alive at the time, still remembers this incident. A year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between South Sudanese demanding political representation and regional autonomy and the central government, who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony after it had been sort of ruled separately during colonialism. This 1956 massacre is linked to the Civil War because striking farmers were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive campaign against Southern rebels. And I highlight this moment because it reveals the ways state violence in Sudan has long been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive war economy that continues to serve elite interests by any means necessary. And I think this helps us hopefully understand a little bit how we got to this point in the way that, for example, the rapid support forces were created to squash dissent, right? In the Darfur region, for example, demands for political representation and development, for example, and so forth, that eventually led to, what happened in 2003 in Darfur, where instead of de-escalating conflicts between over land and other resources, it got escalated by the sort of deployment, the creation of the Janjaweed, who then became the Rapid Support Forces. And so I'm going to skip sort of ahead to the current situation. Since fighting broke out on April 15th, the humanitarian crisis, well, let me not call it a crisis, but the humanitarian situation has deepened and evolved, particularly in Khartoum and in Al Jenaina and West Darfur, but also in Niala, Al Fashir, Al Lubaid, and in other towns and cities. In part because the international humanitarian aid response has been almost non-existent, and that humanitarian assistance and rescue response is for the most part being carried by neighborhood resistance committees. And I should say that the sort of origins of these resistance committees goes, back, some would say even into the 90s, but really the more recent sort of formation of them came out of the 2000, the sort of mid 2013, 11 and 13, where these committees were organizing at a neighborhood level to demand, to mobilize protests against the regime, but also to do things like, distribute necessary, water, food, etc., during situations of crisis, if you will, or difficulty. And so there are about 8,000 of them throughout the country, and they are right now carrying the humanitarian response, distributing food, water, medicines, driving ambulances, identifying safe routes for exit, driving people to safer places within the city. They even evacuated some of the foreign nationals and embassy staff, etc., in the beginning of this fighting. and the doctors union, who have focused on turning a few key hospitals, mostly on the outskirts of the city, into emergency rooms, delivery rooms. But this is all at very great risk to themselves, because both factions, the RSF and the SAF, have targeted and arrested resistance committee activists and doctors and hospital workers. For example, hospitals have been shelled and occupied, mostly by the RSF, although the East Nile hospital was recently hit by a bomb, presumably by the SAF, leaving only 16% of hospitals, mostly on the outskirts of the city, operating at capacity. And we're now 1 month into this fighting. Talking to my relatives, most of whom remain in Khartoum, people have started to run out of food and the banks are still closed. And the army has actually started telling people to evacuate from certain neighborhoods, warning them that they'll be bombing them without providing them with safe routes out. And so what this means is that those who don't have access to, say, money to get out, it's extremely expensive to get out of Khartoum at the moment because fuel prices have skyrocketed, and it's also, of course, dangerous. So people who don't have access to money or family kind of diaspora support, but also, possibly the elderly and sick who are not mobile will be particularly vulnerable in this situation. In terms of, almost 1 million people have been newly displaced since April 15th. And I want people to also note that Sudan has been home to about 1.1 million refugees, one of the largest refugee populations in Africa, mostly from South Sudan, but also Ethiopia and Eritrea. And so to have that number now sort of be replaced by, our own, of course, many of those people have also had to flee. It's also, really quite significant here. And the majority of whom are internally displaced, right? The UN estimates that about $3 billion is needed for the humanitarian response. But as I said, much of it, we haven't seen much on the ground, especially in the areas hardest hit. Much of the focus has been on Khartoum, but actually some of the hardest hit areas have been Al Junaina. Recently in Al Ubayd, 100 people were killed and 1,000 people injured. The army controls the city of Al Ubayd, which is the capital of North Kordofan, but the RSF controls the roads leading into the region. We've also heard that troops have been deployed to the oil-rich region of Abyei since the fighting started, so that's also an area that we should pay attention to. And as I said, these resistance committees, these 8,000 resistance committees across Sudan, who along with various unions and grassroots civil society initiatives really form the backbone of the popular revolution against this regime. They're the ones who are kind of doing this life-saving work, filling a huge vacuum left behind by the international aid agencies that evacuated. And so I encourage you also, in case you feel moved to donate, please support their work. The Sudanese Doctors Union, there's a fundraiser for them. They've been doing really critical work. Your dollar will go much further, and you'll also be simultaneously building the local capacity of the forces that have been demanding a transition to full civilian rule from the very beginning of the revolution, and who have kind of laid out a revolutionary charter or political platform for what this transition to a popular democracy can look like once the fighting stops, and these generals and all those responsible for war crimes that span decades, not only in Darfur, the Nuba Mountains in South Sudan, but now also in Khartoum, and this sort of culminated in this fighting, are brought to justice. I also want to mention that at least 190 people have gone missing since the fighting began, and according to the Missing Initiative, which is a volunteer organization founded after the RSF massacred, broke up a sit-in, a peaceful sit-in in front of the military headquarters during the height of the revolution, killing at least 120 people in 2019. And so they started then, people have continued to go missing even after this massacre. And, a lot of the people missing, some people it is said that the RSF has arrested them for doing some of this critical life-saving work. There's also been reports of the RSF forcibly recruiting people to fight. I want to talk briefly about the border crisis. Most people who are attempting to leave the country are leaving via Egypt, South Sudan, Chad, and Port Sudan. I was just there, and during this fighting, and we left through Port Sudan, in part because we were hearing that it was taking a week or more to get a visa approved at the Egyptian border. And I couldn't fathom my own 90-year-old father being able to manage that. He's got some issues, right? And so the wait has gotten longer, and people stuck at the border don't have access to adequate shelter, food, or water. The last I heard, the Egyptians were processing 7,000, there are currently 7,000 passports being processed at 100 passports a day, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? Why can't the Egyptian government just let people in and allow those that wish to apply for asylum do so later, or at the very least bring in people to expedite this process? And why are there no international humanitarian agencies offering support at the border, right? I hear that there are Egyptian and Sudanese volunteers that are distributing food and water, but again, this is a volunteer effort, right? We left on a huge ship provided by the Saudis that had the capacity to carry over 2,000 passengers in a huge cargo area, and many ships came after that to evacuate mostly foreign nationals. Why didn't any of them bring in food, drinking water, medicines, etc., right? The first ship to do so arrived about 2 weeks after the fighting broke out. I also want to say most people evacuating out of Khartoum are not trying to leave the country per se. They're trying to get to places that are safer within the country. So northern, eastern Sudan, places like Kassala, Dongola, parts of the Jazeera, which is south of Khartoum. And of course, it's hard because, as I mentioned, it's very expensive and unsafe. We spent a couple of days before evacuating in my father's village. First, we were in Khartoum, then we left to go there. And I just want to briefly mention, we're about to come up to the planting season. It usually begins at the end of May before the rainy season. And because of safety concerns and the lack of availability of inputs, seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, electricity to pump water, it's unlikely to take place. And much of the land in my father's village that people used to farm on was seized by the state under al-Bashir, the regime, and leased to a domestic investor with external Emirati financing. And this has meant that most people have moved out of farming and herding into brick making. But this dispossession is felt most acutely in these moments, right? Where my aunt, for example, doesn't have the reserves of sorghum and beans that she used to have when my family still farmed. Rural stores have become much more reliant on food from Khartoum and imported foods from the Gulf and Asia. We've seen a shift away from the staple sorghum to wheat, which is mostly produced in a factory in Khartoum that was hit during this fighting. So there's a kind of looming food crisis in the areas that people are fleeing to, right? Which is also where there's also no electricity and water. And I want to end briefly with a note on external actors. I study Saudi and Emirati land investments in central Sudan and the ways they've fundamentally altered the rural economy and livelihood and the various forms of resistance and organizing that have emerged against land dispossession in their aftermath. The Saudis and Emiratis have invested about $27 billion in Sudan over the last 2 decades, mostly in land, real estate, and infrastructure. The Emiratis recently signed in June of last year a $6 billion deal to build a port and airport along the ports in the Port Sudan area.